Hey, gang, it's Reed Galen, your host for today. I'm coming to you solo at the moment. Our guest is running a few minutes behind. It is noon in the East, it is 9 a.m. in the West, and this is Lunch with Lincoln for Monday, November 28th, 2022. I hope that everyone had a happy and healthy and safe Thanksgiving. I hope you didn't eat too much. I know, and I'm still getting over it. Anyway, gang, all right, so here we are. Oh! And right as I'm beginning my full vamp, David appears. David Rothkopf, welcome to the show.
I want to hear the full vamp.
Well, listen, you could have just stayed backstage. I'd have given you half an hour of all the best I had to offer. So, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. So, David, you and I have spoken in the past. I think we had you on the podcast a few months back. You are a longtime foreign policy expert, served in the Clinton administration way back when, have been, I would say, prolific in the different kinds of work you've done, the different kinds of organizations you've started. And so, wanted to have you on today to talk a little bit about how you see the world here in a post November 22 world, a pre 2024 world, and a pre Republican House of Representatives. But first, I want to talk about your new book called American Resistance. And the idea here is that it was the quote unquote deep state that helped save the day. So, first and foremost, welcome to the show. But tell us a little bit about your new book.
Well, thanks. It's a pleasure to be talking with you again. As far as the book, um, yeah. I mean, you have to ask yourself a question, which is why would Trump, why would the extreme right target the deep state? First of all, there isn't a deep state, and the idea of a sort of broad, deep government conspiracy, it just doesn't bear any, any scrutiny. There's no evidence for it. So why do it? Well, it's the same reason that they put forth the notion of fake news, because the truth is destabilizing to them. The truth is a threat to them. And so those who pervade the truth, they want to discredit. And they've said as much themselves. And the same is true with the deep state. We discovered during the Trump administration, especially, that of all the guardrails that we have in our government to protect us from a rogue president or a group of people within the administration who disregard their oaths to the Constitution, there was one that didn't fail when others did, right? The Congress didn't work because there was a Republican Senate and they didn't see the responsibility, and look where that got us, to
Mm-hmm.
hold Trump accountable. The courts didn't do it because you can pack the courts. But within the United States government, there were hundreds and hundreds of people who took their oath seriously, took the Constitution seriously. And when the President of the United States or those around him said, do this illegal thing, or do this crazy thing, or do this immoral thing, they said, no, sir, I can't. It's against the law. Or they said, here's the law. You have to change that executive order. Or they said, no, sir, you have to tell the people the truth about COVID. You have a responsibility. Or no, sir, don't move all the US troops out of NATO. Don't attack North Korea. Don't launch missiles at Mexico. And so I thought, let's tell that story, because
Mm-hmm.
not only is it an important story, um, not only is it a story in which the heroes are Republicans and Democrats and independents, they're just, they're the people in the government who swore an oath, but this is also a group that Trump and those who would succeed Trump are now targeting, saying, we want to fire, we want to be able to fire them all. There's this idea of this Schedule F, which Trump and
Right.
Biden got rid of. And why do they want to be able to fire them? Well, the same reason they wanted to get rid of inspectors generals who were looking into them, the same reason they wanted to put in place cabinet secretaries on an acting basis, because they didn't want them to be scrutinized by the Congress. They want a pliant government. And if we get a pliant government, that's a step towards authoritarianism. So we need
Right.
to understand these stories because they're heroic and inspiring, and these people deserve credit. But we also need to understand them because we're going to be encountering this again soon. And we need to know how we protect democracy against this particular kind of attack.
So I think back to the summer of 2020, I should say, when in the wake of George Floyd's murder, there were demonstrations all over the country, including in Washington, D.C. And a lot of the, what the Russians, I guess, would call, the Ukrainians might call, the little green men started appearing, right? These were federal officers and or agents in fatigues, in, riot gear, masks, helmets, sunglasses, no distinguishing marks, no indication of what agency they came from. We saw that, to your point about the acting, Chad Wolf, the acting Department of Homeland Security, sent DHS officers and agents into Portland with the apparent desire to incite violence, right, for the purposes of political gain. So, to your point, we saw that when the time came, that enough people did uphold their oaths. But we've also seen, as you noted, what Trump can do as a sitting president. So now talk to us, give us a little sense of some of the examples of the folks who upheld their oaths, and then give us a sense of what concerns you as we're looking forward to this 20-year period.
Well, the example that you gave is a good example. During the riots in the wake of the George Floyd incident, the president's first impulse was to send in the 101st Airborne Division. And Secretary of Defense at the time, Mark Esper, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Milley, they said, no, you can't do that. You can't deploy troops against Americans.
And this is posse comitatus, right?
Right. And this is why they came up with the Little Green Men. They had little pockets of people who had control over some law enforcement. There were some from DOJ as well, I think. And those people said, okay, you can use our people to send this message. Trump, you may recall, tried to send a message to the world that the military was on his side on this thing. When he staged this walk across Lafayette Park, he was going to this church to hold up a Bible. He asked Esper and Milley to join him. As they were halfway across the park, they realized, hey, we're being used here for purposes that we think are wrong. And Milley literally just walked away in the middle of the park. And both he and Esper, stood up against Trump even more aggressively from then on in.
Just on that one note, David, there's that photo, or I guess the video of them too, where Bill Barr, at that point Attorney General, is walking, tireless, like with an open collar, has as close to a sort of Eastern European director of internal security look as I've ever seen, probably.
Yeah, absent the bad sunglasses, you're absolutely right. But this is Bill Barr. Bill Barr is an interesting case, right? Bill Barr did some terrible things. He crushed the Mueller report. He turned the Justice Department into being essentially the attorneys for President Trump. But even he, at a certain point, said, "No, I can't go across this line. I can't support you actually stealing the election." Just 6 months after that. And I think it's very important for us to be able to say these guys did this stuff wrong, and then they stood up here. So we understand, how these things work. So we understand how to avoid problems like this in the future. But, in the book, I talked to over 100 people, and there are stories that are very diverse. At the beginning of the administration, the president wanted to impose a Muslim ban. And, he had some guys, and they hammered out an executive order without talking to DHS, put it in place, didn't inform
anybody.
And you recall chaos in the airports, right? Then the court said, no, you can't actually do this just for no reason. And the only reason that works is a security reason. And so the lawyers got to work, and they spent a considerable period of time saying, no, Mr. President, we have to have a reason. They went out to every embassy. They polled the embassies on what they thought were security issues. They went out and they identified cases where banning, entry from a country because it was a threat country that, as Trump had posed it, like Iraq, or Afghanistan, might have a negative consequence for people who helped the United States, and we needed to let
Right.
into the country. And so the people behind this, some of whom were at the cabinet level or sub-cabinet level, some of whom are just lawyers you've never heard of in these departments, actually managed to dilute, delay, and effectively defang the Muslim ban. But we saw examples of this with COVID, where the president wanted to suppress the data on COVID, where people
Right.
around the president wanted him not to provide aid to blue states, and people, whether it was
That person in particular, his name is Jared Kushner.
that person in particular is Jared Kushner, and there were people like Dr. Tony Fauci and people on the task force, people who worked in the White House, who said, no, we can't do this. We have to handle this in a different way. And they had to find a workaround with the president, and they came up with this idea of 15 days to stop the spread. Did they think it would be stopped in 15 days? No, but they didn't think Trump would approve more than 15 days. So they said, let's go and do this first, and then we'll extend it. But they had to find a workaround to keep the president from doing maximum damage. And you found this in case after case after case. I found it with regard to, everybody saw it with regard to his desire to blackmail Ukraine. And Congress had allocated $291 million, and people in the government said, hey, wait a minute, you can't withhold that after the Congress has
Right.
approved it. And when the president essentially communicated that to the new president of Ukraine, Zelensky, Alexander Vindman went across the hall, went across the campus of the White House, went to the NSC lawyer. At the same time, a whistleblower did the same thing. And within a couple of weeks, the money got released. Why? Because there were whistleblowers, there was transparency, there were people who were willing to put their jobs on the line. And that's another thing that we see in this story is time after time, the people who put their jobs on the line because of their oath of office, because of the interest of the American people, like Vindman, they got fired. The woman
Well,
who
and just you saw just, was it yesterday or the day before, David, that with Alex Vindman in particular, Elon Musk, newly CEO of Twitter, attacked Vindman personally as, quote, both puppet and puppeteer, right?
yeah, and
And so it's just one of those weird things where, like, the people that do the right thing are now immediately, he must have been working for somebody, right? Something else must have been at play. Why else would he have done this?
not entirely coincidentally, Elon Musk, within hours of that, also released a picture of George Soros as a puppeteer.
Mm.
So not only was he going after Vindman, but he was dealing in anti-Semitic tropes because, of course, Soros isn't a puppeteer, but people like to say Soros globalists, etc., because that's all code word for Jews. And Musk has revealed himself for what he is. He's kind of a tool of this MAGA GOP, and this right wing movement that extends, around the world, from Moscow and Putin to Bolsonaro in Brazil, or Orban in Hungary, or Trump and company here. And Musk has signed on to that. And
Right.
everything, if you look at what he's done at Twitter, none of it makes sense in the context of um, being the CEO of a company trying to increase its value. None of it
Right.
makes sense in terms of creating a better product. It only makes sense if what you're trying to do is empower the extreme right, and that's
Well, and something I said to him, although I don't think he knows who I am, nor does he care, that he, like Trump, is also a narcissist. He loves this. He loves spinning the top and watching everybody go crazy. He loves it.
look, clearly a very damaged guy. Don't know, what his father gave him beside pockets full of emeralds to go and buy his companies, but certainly he's come out of all of this with this narcissism that you indicate, this desire to put himself at the center of all of this controversy. And frankly, I think, uh, kind of cluelessness and naivete about how politics work, and he thinks somehow that people are buying his bullshit. But of course, only the people he pays are buying his bullshit, right? Or only the
Right, and
people.
that's less people every day. So let's talk about this, David. So let's talk about the flip side, which is the little green men and the people who order them to do things. As you know, especially, we don't have a deep state now, but an authoritarian regime under a second Trump or something like him would utilize those power ministries: justice, defense, intelligence, homeland security, right? For their own purposes, to in fact install a deep state that surveilled Americans, made sure everybody stayed in line. So, and you mentioned the Schedule F thing, which Steve Bannon of all people said that they were recruiting quote unquote shock troops to go into the federal government when Trump returns to office to basically tear out what wiring they couldn't get to in the first 4 years of his presidency.
Yeah, I mean, I call it the book "The Dark State" as opposed to the Deep State.
Okay,
Just to make a distinction. But
sure.
we saw Trump as when Trump got to office, he didn't have a clue as to how the White House ran or what a president did, and he just thought he could run it the way he ran his company. And then these people throughout the government said, "No, Mr. President, you have to follow the law." They weren't, by the way. I really want to underscore this. They weren't being insubordinate. They were actually following the will of the people. He was elected by the will of the people, but they were also following the will of the people as manifest through laws passed by the Congress. I mean, which is another way the will of the people is institutionalized in the United States. And he said, "Oh, well, this won't do." So he comes up with, putting in place the Chad Wolfs or the Chris Millers or the Cash Patels or the Rick Grinnells in these various other government agencies, doesn't go through confirmation, puts it in place. What are their qualifications? Well,
Hmm.
often they had none at all, except they were loyal to him. And that's what you can expect in the future. And frankly, one of the interesting things about doing this book, I talked to 100 people. Some of them had served in past administrations, some were young,
Right.
some were old. The majority were Republican, many of them were Democrats. Almost all of them said the thing that frightened them the most was what a second term would look like, because
Hmm.
Trump will have learned these lessons and will put in place his own stooges atop these agencies. And, if he can implement this Schedule F thing, what Bannon referred to as these shock troops, and you will take a giant step towards authoritarianism in the United States.
Do you think, maybe I'm overplaying this? Do you think that with even a narrow margin in the U.S. House, that there are staff members, senior staff members, lawyers who currently or will soon go to work for the Marjorie Taylor Greens, the Jim Jordans of the world, who will learn how to do this stuff better and be ready to go back into a Trump or a Republican administration when the time comes?
Absolutely. I'll give you a perfect example of it because, of course, one of the loyalists who has stood by Trump's side through everything post January 6th and was at the middle of each of these sort of phases of the presidency, helped draft the faulty executive order regarding the Muslim ban, tried to do some of the most outrageous things regarding the border, sending troops to the border, shooting people on the border, and so forth, kept running afoul of the law, and then tried to find these workarounds with Stephen Miller. Stephen Miller stays at Trump's side. So, what happened the other day when Nancy Pelosi was announcing that she would not run for another term as Speaker of the House? Well, Steve Scalise showed up for it because she had spoken kindly of him when he had been shot. But who didn't show up? Well, the next Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy. What was Kevin McCarthy doing at that time? He was meeting with Stephen Miller. He chose to meet with this guy who's in the middle of all of this, rather than to do show a modicum of respect for the institution in which he was going to play a bigger role in the future. And so, yeah, these types of folks are going to take the lessons they've learned from the past 4 years, and they're going to use the next 2 years, and then whatever they can thereafter, to tee things up so that it is easier for the next president, if it's a Republican, if it's an extreme right Republican, to exert authority without being contradicted. And I guarantee you, by the way, if it's not Donald Trump, then it'll be Ron DeSantis. He runs the same kind of state in Florida that
Sure.
Trump wants to run here, where somebody expresses a view contrary to him, he fires them. If somebody's got data that's contrary to his narrative about COVID, he suppresses the data. If there are people in the state who are learning things in the schools that are contrary to the ideology he wants to sell, he bans that teaching in the schools. If there are companies that are supporting it, he kicks those companies out of the state. He is a little tin pot dictator in Florida. And so if you think, well, we'll get past Trump and we'll get to, the post-authoritarian impulse in the MAGA GOP, that's not true.
Well, I think this is look, David, this is a hugely important point. I want the folks out there to understand this, which is the Twitter sphere and the media has been going, gnashing of teeth and renting of garments over this dinner that Trump had on West at Fuentes. And Nick Fuentes is a truly awful human being and deserves to be called out as such. And the reason why, David, that no Republicans have been talking about this, right, is because one, they need the voters that the kind of guy like Nick Fuentes represents. Secondly, they need the voters that Donald Trump represents. And lastly, if it furthers all of their own aims, they're fine with it. Why are the big money guys okay with it? Because Trump did everything they asked of him, right? They lowered taxes, he gutted regulations. Why are the deplorables happy with it? Because he made it okay to be deplorable. Why are the Gen Xers and everybody in the middle okay with it? Because he also allowed them to be the people they want to be and to go into a resource hoarding mode, right? That was suddenly okay, right? The evangelicals, he gave them everything they wanted, all the judges, all the craziness, right? So the idea now that like the Nick Fuentes thing is now like some outrage that they're going to get upset about. He tried to overthrow the damn government and they didn't get upset about that. And so you're absolutely right. And it's not just DeSantis, right? It's Youngkin. It's all of these people who, Trump is getting a lot of the blame for this, right? Because they want to blame him. But Youngkin, DeSantis, Nikki Haley, Ted Cruz, all of these people, they all endorsed the nuttiest of the nutty. They all campaigned for the nuttiest of the nutty. And now they want to blame it on Trump. But David, here's the other part that I think it worries me, is that these people didn't lose by that much. And in fact, Republicans got 5 million more votes than Democrats did this year. Now, we could go into the technical reasons of gerrymandering, but the point is that their numbers are going up. Trump's numbers went up significantly in 20. Now, thank God Joe Biden's went up even further, right? But we should not, under any circumstances, believe that this is somehow a threat that is in our past.
Totally agree. One of the reasons that I wrote the book, one of the things that I've been going around saying about this book is this may be a history of the period between 2016 and 2020, but its relevance is to the future. The reason to read about this is because this threat remains. And I think you've just done as good a job describing it as anybody I've ever heard, because, at the end of the day, people say, surely these big business people who back the Republican Party know that every time Republican is president, the deficit goes up. Every time a Republican is president, GDP performance goes down. When Democrats are president, more jobs are created than when Republicans are president. When Democrats are president, the stock market goes up more. And so you say, well, these are smart business people. Why would they support policies that might not result in a better economy for everybody? And the answer is they don't care about the economy for everybody. They care about the economy for themselves. And if they have a bigger piece of the pie, they don't care if the pie is getting smaller. And so if they get the tax cuts they want and they get the deregulation that they want, that's fine. And are they willing to sell the country on a path towards Christo-fascism in order to
Sure.
do that, to invite white supremacists in? Absolutely. They've proven that for decades, and they are proving it, doubling down now. And your point that they have been silent in the wake of this little anti-Semitic, dinner party at Mar-a-Lago, in which one after another the guest was more repulsive than the next, um, is
And that's saying something when you start with Donald Trump.
well, that's I gotta tell you, I totally agree with you. I've been reading all this stuff, and people are going, "Oh, Nick Fuentes, he's terrible," and Kanye, he's an anti-Semite. The worst of the bunch was Trump. I
Right.
mean, Nick Fuentes is a neo-Nazi twerp,
Right.
repulsive, but in terms of the damage that he's done, or in terms of odious ideologies, Trump outstrips him all the way, but they're
Right.
willing to take it. And Glenn Youngkin will take it with a nice fleece on, and Kristi
Right.
Noem will take it looking like she just walked off a pageant stage. And the Ron DeSantis will sort of grin and bear it as long as he can with Trump, and then he'll try to steal all those people onto his team. But at the end of the day, what they're about is what you're talking about, which is if they win the Republican primary, and to win the primary, you need the hard right,
Right.
then they can, put into, advance their broader agenda. And, I only hope they're paying a little attention, because they can't win the general election if Liz Cheney is out there chipping away and takes 2, 3, 4, 5% of their vote. They
Well,
can't.
that's the other part of this too. Is before we talk about Cheney, let's be clear. If Trump loses a Republican primary, he will do everything to make sure that whoever won it loses. Right? He's not going to be a guy who's like, oh, you know what? I lost fair and square. It was a good fight. My turn is over. Right? Let's go off and sing Kumbaya together. He's going to tell all those MAGA people to stay home, and they probably will.
I hope you're not afflicted with the same thing I am, but I'm such a product of this moment that when you say that, all I can think of is these Twitter memes of a guy eating popcorn. It's like, yeah, okay, let's see it. Donald Trump, you want to go after Ron DeSantis? I will pay money for a ringside seat to watch you guys self-destruct. And
Right.
there usually comes a time when you make a deal with the devil that you have to pay the price. And the price the Republican Party has got to contend with is that Donald Trump is so pathologically narcissistic and
Right.
has no ideological attachment to any of them. And frankly, sees the entire party in terms of just what it means for his life,
Right.
that he would have no problem whatsoever undermining DeSantis or whomever until they lost again, so he could say, see what losers they were, they need me.
Right. No, listen, all he has to do is tell the RNC, don't ever use my name again. Right. Small dollar fundraising through the floor. There's that great movie that came out a couple of years back, David, about Chernobyl, which in the sort of final scene, the lead character says, every lie owes a debt to the truth, right? And like it's as good a way as I can describe the Republican Party as it is today, in that the whole thing is based on lies, and eventually all those lies will come due. But we should not underestimate the ability and willingness of all of those people to do incredible damage to you, me, and everybody in the process. All right, David, give us a closing thought in here as we close in on half an hour.
Well, I'd underscore your point about the last election, because a lot of Democrats were dancing in the aisles saying it could have been, we didn't lose the Senate. It could have been much worse in the House. And believe me, I understand that. And I think particularly the rejection of election deniers in key battleground states is extremely important. But as you point out, it was a tie. This was a 50-50 election. And if you think the fever has broken with the extreme right wing and their lust for power and their appetite for more authoritarian, less democratic U.S. government, you got it completely wrong. And the heavy lifting is ahead of us. It's not behind us.
Well, amen to that. David, thank you for joining me. Everybody get out there and buy American Resistance, David's new book. We're going to leave you with an ad we have running in Georgia right now. David, thank you for joining me, and everybody else, we'll see you soon.
Thanks a lot, Reed. Bye-bye.
The Choice. 2 candidates. 2 men. A choice that will decide how the world sees Georgia. For Georgia, it's simple. The choice is Raphael Warnock. Principled, bipartisan, a passionate leader rooted in faith and service to Georgia. A legacy of leadership, making lives better in the community. He's done more than just fight for us in Washington, D.C. Raphael Warnock has made us proud. He's worked across the aisle to get things done, putting people before party and politics. Herschel Walker? Troubled, confused, untruthful, and unreliable. And yes, violent. Walker isn't honest with his own family or with us. Warnock will lead for all Georgia. Walker will embarrass us for 6 long years. Come to think of it, this election really isn't a choice at all. Raphael Warnock for United States Senate.
The Lincoln Project paid for and is responsible for the content of this advertising.